The moment I picked up the phone, I knew Darren wasn't calling to ask how we were. His voice had that strange, sharp excitement he gets when he thinks he's finally outsmarted everyone. "We're moving tomorrow," he said. "And your beach house?" "Sold. Papers signed. So, enjoy whatever time you've got left there." I stood in the kitchen, my hand still on the receiver, listening to the drip of the faucet and Elaine's slippers shuffling behind me as she set the kettle on. Something inside me tightened, not in anger, but in a kind of tired disbelief. A disbelief only a 60-year-old man understands when he realizes his own son sees him as a burden to rearrange, not a father to respect. Before I could answer, I heard Marissa laughing in the background, saying, "Finally, that place is going to someone who'll actually use it." Their voices blended into this cold, careless chorus, like they had rehearsed it. I glanced out the window at our small backyard, where the old wind chime I made for Elaine years ago tapped gently in the breeze. I remembered building that beach house deck with my own hands, sanding every board, dreaming of grandkids running across it. And now my son was tossing it away like a scratched yard sale chair. I took a slow breath. "Darren," I said, "you forgot one thing." He groaned immediately. "Dad, don't start. The deal is done. We're adults. We made a decision." I felt a familiar ache in my chest, not physical, but emotional, like a bruise pressed by someone who doesn't realize how deep it goes. And then, speaking as naturally as if I were commenting on the weather, I added, "Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories." Elaine quietly chuckled at how confused Darren must have looked hearing that, because she already knew what he didn't. And the truth he didn't see coming was standing right in front of him, waiting to knock the arrogance clean out of his voice. After that phone call ended, I stood there longer than I'd like to admit, staring at the kitchen tiles like they might offer some wisdom. Elaine slid a mug of tea in front of me, the one with a faded picture of a seagull she bought at a beach market 15 years ago. "He really thinks he sold it?" she asked, raising an eyebrow the way she does when something is so absurd it circles back to being funny. I nodded, rubbing my forehead. "Apparently our son now moonlights as a real estate tycoon," I said. "Next thing you know, he'll tell us he sold our neighbor's dog because it barked too confidently." Elaine actually snorted a sharp, sudden sound that always makes her blush afterward. That little laugh eased something in my chest, but only for a moment. Because when I sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of what Darren had tried to do settled over me like a wet blanket. I looked around our home, the mismatched chairs we never replaced, the crooked picture frame of our first trip to the ocean, the stack of mail I kept meaning to sort, but kept avoiding, because every envelope seemed to start with important. This house had history etched into every corner, and so did the beach house. And yet my son treated it all like inventory. Assets. Numbers. A chessboard he could rearrange while assuming his parents were too old or too soft to notice. The bitterness rose in me, but so did something else, a strange, steady humor. "You know," I told Elaine, "the kid has guts. Wrong guts, but guts. Trying to sell a house he doesn't own? If he used that confidence for good, he could run for mayor." Elaine swatted my arm with the dish towel, but she smiled. Still, beneath the jokes, the hurt lingered. I couldn't pretend it didn't sting being seen as someone to be handled, managed, pushed aside. There's a sharp humiliation in realizing your own child thinks you're past the point of understanding your own life. For a second, I felt 60 going on 90. I thought back to my father, stubborn, proud, refusing help even when he needed it, and I wondered if I was turning into him without noticing. But then I shook my head. No, this wasn't about weakness. This was about boundaries he chose to ignore. Down the hall, a drawer jammed, the same drawer that jams every winter because the wood swells. I yanked it open too hard, and the whole thing nearly fell on my foot. Elaine called out, "Everything okay?" I muttered, "Perfectly fine. Just wrestling the furniture again." She laughed softly, and I couldn't help joining her. For all the cracks in our life, we still knew how to find humor in the mess. But as the tea cooled in my hands, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Darren had crossed a line he didn't even see, and that line had been drawn months before he picked up the phone. Because long before our son tried to take control of our lives, we had already taken control of our future, he just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, not because I wanted to, but because my back decided sleep was optional. I shuffled into the kitchen, trying to stretch, without making the noises that betray a man my age. Elaine was already there, humming to herself, peeling an orange with the concentration of a surgeon. "Rough night?" she asked without looking up. "Not at all," I said. "My spine just prefers improvisational jazz at 5 a.m. She smirked a tiny smirk, but it warmed me more than the coffee brewing beside her. But even the small comforts of the morning couldn't drown out yesterday's conversation. Darren's words replayed in my mind, louder than the old fridge humming in the corner. I kept trying to understand when exactly the boy I'd raised started treating responsibility like a negotiation, and his parents like outdated software. There's a strange kind of ache that comes with that realization, as if a draft blows through a room you thought was sealed shut. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel it fully. The disappointment, the guilt, the fear that maybe I'd failed somewhere along the way. I told Elaine, "You know, I still remember taking him to the beach the first time. He was terrified of the water, thought the waves were trying to steal his sandals." She laughed quietly. "And you told him the ocean was loud because it was excited to meet him." I winced. "Good grief. I really said that?" She nodded. "You did, and he believed you for years." For a second, the memory softened me. But only for a second, because the boy who once clung to my shoulder now talked to me like a man stepping over a puddle, mildly annoyed the puddle existed. I opened the cabinet to grab the sugar, and a bag of rice slipped out, hit the counter, and burst open like a fireworks display for ants. Tiny grains scattered everywhere in my slippers, under the toaster, possibly into another dimension. Elaine covered her mouth to hide her laugh. "Frank," she said, "I love you, but you'd lose a battle with a salad bowl." I sighed dramatically. One day, when they build monuments to great men, they'll tell the tale of the rice that defeated me. But even while sweeping up the mess, I felt the growing certainty of what we needed to do. Darren wasn't going to stop at one house. Not if we let him believe we were powerless. And truth be told, the trust we'd set up months earlier wasn't the only safeguard Luther had talked us into. I looked at Elaine and said, "He thinks he has us cornered. But the real question is, how do we tell him the truth without lighting our whole family on fire?" She leaned against the counter, thoughtful. "Maybe," she said softly, "he needs to feel the heat first." And in that moment, something shifted. Not anger, not revenge, but a quiet resolve. Because protecting what's ours wasn't about fighting him. It was about letting the truth walk up to him on its own 2 feet. Later that day, I decided to drive down to the beach house myself. Not because anything urgent needed doing, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes. Breathe that salty air. Remind myself why I fought so hard to protect it. Elaine insisted on coming along, naturally. And naturally she insisted on bringing snacks, blankets, and what looked like half the medicine cabinet, just in case. By the time we reached the car, I felt like a Sherpa preparing for Everest, not a 60-year-old man going for a drive. The road to the coast was quiet, golden with late morning sun. I rolled the window down, letting the smell of seaweed and distant barbecue drift in. For a moment, I felt young again, the kind of young a man feels when he remembers he once had more hair and fewer bills. But as we pulled up beside the house, the memory dissolved into something sharper, heavier. There it stood. Our little weather-worn cottage with peeling paint, cracked steps, and a porch railing that leans just slightly to the left, like it's listening in on every conversation. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't new. But it was ours, built out of sweat, stubbornness, and weekends spent with Elaine handing me tools I never asked for. I stepped out of the car and immediately tripped over the uneven edge of the walkway, the same spot I've tripped over every single summer since 2008. Elaine burst out laughing. "One day," she said, wiping a tear of laughter, "gravity is going to send you an apology letter." I grunted, rubbing my shin. "I swear that stone moves on purpose. It hates me." She just shook her head, handing me a bottle of water like that was going to heal my dignity. Inside the house, everything felt exactly the same. The faint smell of sunscreen embedded in the walls, the humming of the old air conditioner, the sun-bleached picture frames we never updated. I walked to the sliding door and looked out at the ocean, thinking about how Darren saw this place as nothing more than a bargaining chip, a way to elevate his life without lifting a finger. And while the ache of that betrayal tugged at me, something else tugged harder. The realization that he didn't understand what legacy meant. To him, legacy was money. To me and Elaine, it was memory. I stood there silently for a long time, until Elaine came up beside me. "We did the right thing," she said gently, "even if he never understands why." I nodded, but a knot still tightened in my stomach, because I knew this wouldn't end with one phone call. Darren wasn't the type to roll over when things didn't go his way, and if he truly believed that he had a claim here, he'd fight tooth and nail, no matter how wrong he was. Then, as if summoned by that very thought, my phone buzzed. A message from Darren flashed across the screen. "We're coming by tomorrow to finalize things. Be ready." Elaine read the message over my shoulder. "Finalize what, exactly?" she asked. I sighed, slipping the phone into my pocket. "Apparently," I said, "he's ready for round 2. But what he didn't realize was that the ground he planned to stand on had already vanished, and the fall was coming fast. The next morning, I woke up feeling like someone had stuffed my ribs with rocks. Not pain, just the weight of everything that was coming. Darren's message kept replaying in my head, each word dripping with entitlement. Finalize things. As if this house were a package waiting for his signature. As if Elaine and I were squatters overstaying our welcome. I shuffled into the kitchen, and before I could even sit, I knocked over the container of coffee grounds. It spilled across the counter like dark sand on a beach. Elaine sighed, but she was smiling. "Frank, one day I'm going to put you in a padded kitchen. All soft surfaces. No sharp corners, no breakables." I grunted, trying to brush the coffee into a pile that somehow kept getting bigger, like it was multiplying just to mock me. But underneath the humor, my nerves were crawling. Darren hadn't just crossed a line, he'd set up camp on the other side and sent invitations. I sat at the table, elbows on the wood, and felt that old familiar mix of dread and determination, a blend men my age learned to recognize like an unwelcome relative. "You think he'll come angry?" I asked Elaine. She poured tea with the kind of calm only she could maintain in moments like this. "He'll come convinced he's right," she said. "That's worse." I stared at my hands, rough, wrinkled, still stained in tiny places from years of repairs, paint jobs, and projects I always swore I'd finish next season. These hands built the deck outside. These hands carried Darren when he fell asleep on my shoulder after long beach days. And yet, in his eyes now, these hands were old tools ready for the donation box. The humiliation simmered deep, hotter than anger. But beneath that simmer was something steadier, a quiet fire I hadn't felt in years. I grabbed the folder Luther gave us, the trust papers, the recorded deed, the backup copies he insisted we keep. Elaine watched me flip through them with a focus she hadn't seen in a long time. "You're really ready for this?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm tired of letting him believe we're helpless." "We're not." Then, because fate has a sense of humor, the front door creaked loudly. My attempt at reinforcing the hinges last summer had the opposite effect. Elaine chuckled. "Great entrance, Frank. Very intimidating." I huffed. "I'll fix it later." She raised an eyebrow. "Like the loose floorboard you've been fixing later for 3 years?" I pointed a finger at her. "I fixed it in my mind. That counts for something." But when the sound of a car rolling into the driveway reached us, the humor evaporated. My heart thudded once. Hard. Elaine took my hand not in fear, but in solidarity. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we stand together." Footsteps approached. Darren's heavy stride, Marissa's sharper one. I felt every muscle in my body tense. I wasn't afraid of confrontation. I was afraid of seeing just how little empathy remained in my son's face. The doorknob turned. He didn't even knock. And in that single thoughtless gesture, that small act of barging into our space, I understood just how badly this confrontation needed to happen.
When Darren opened that door without knocking, I swear the temperature in the room dropped a few degrees. Not because of anger, though heaven knows there was enough of that, but because in that instant, I saw something in my son's eyes I hadn't seen since he was a teenager stealing my car keys. The certainty that nothing could touch him. He marched in like a landlord checking on tenants, not a son visiting his parents. Marissa followed with her arms crossed, scanning our home with that familiar expression that always suggested she was mentally replacing everything with more expensive versions. Frank stood up too fast and nearly knocked over his chair. He caught it by the very tip, wobbling like a circus performer who hadn't rehearsed. Under any other circumstances, I would have laughed until my ribs ached, but right now his clumsiness felt like vulnerability exposed. Darren didn't even notice. He was too busy straightening his jacket like he was about to deliver a keynote speech. "All right," Darren said, clapping his hands once. "Let's get this done quickly. The buyers want confirmation today." I stepped forward before Frank could respond. My husband is a good man, too good, too emotional, too soft when it comes to the people he loves, and I could see the hurt tightening around his shoulders. I wasn't going to let that be used against him again. "Darren," I said, keeping my voice calm, "sit down. You're not here to lecture us." He blinked like the idea had never crossed his mind that someone might tell him what to do. Marissa let out a tiny scoff. "Elaine, darling," she said, "the house is already in motion. It's better if you two just let us handle the details. You've had your time with it." Had my hands been free, I might have applauded her nerve. Instead, I reached into the drawer behind me and accidentally pulled it too far. The whole thing slid out, crashed onto the floor, and sent about 12 pens, 3 batteries, and a mysterious rubber band collection scattering across the tiles. Frank muttered, "I tightened those rails last year," and I whispered back, "And they clearly listen to you about as much as Darren does." Marissa rolled her eyes. "Can we be adults for 5 minutes?" I crouched down, picking up the pens one by one, not because I cared about them, but because it gave me a moment to steady myself. When I stood, I met Darren's gaze fully, and something in me, something maternal, fierce, protective, rose like a tide. "You didn't sell this house," I said quietly. "You can't sell what isn't yours." He laughed, actually laughed, like I'd told the world's funniest joke. "Mom, please, don't embarrass yourself. The agent already checked." "The agent checked the wrong records," I cut in, "because the house isn't under your father's name anymore." Frank looked at me, then really looked surprised by how steady my voice was. I squeezed his hand briefly. Darren frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" I moved to the cabinet near the window and took out the folder we'd kept tucked behind the old tax forms, the one Luther gave us, the one we'd discussed at the dining table months ago, during a quiet evening when Darren was too busy to visit and we finally admitted to ourselves that protecting our future meant protecting our home. I laid the folder on the table. "Sit," I told him again. This time he obeyed. Because for the first time that day, our son realized he wasn't steering this conversation, and he had no idea just how much control he never actually had. Darren sat, though the way he dropped into the chair made it clear he wasn't doing it out of respect, more like someone humoring a child who insisted the crayons had opinions. Marissa perched beside him, arms crossed so tightly she looked like she was trying to keep her spine from running away. I placed the folder on the table with a soft thud. It wasn't a dramatic sound, but it carried weight, the kind that makes a room go quiet. Frank stood behind me, and I could feel him fidgeting. He always does that when things get serious, taps his fingers, shifts his weight, rearranges imaginary objects on the table. It's endearing in small doses, but today he was buzzing like a nervous bee. At one point, he tried to lean casually on the counter and almost slipped on a pen we'd missed earlier. I shot him a look, and he mouthed, "I'm fine," though his face said otherwise. I opened the folder slowly, letting Darren's confidence drain one drop at a time. "This," I said, pulling out the first set of documents, "is the trust agreement. It was filed 6 months ago." He squinted at the pages as if the words were personally attacking him. "A trust? For what?" "For the house," I answered. "For our protection, for our future, and for your daughter's future." At the mention of Ivy, our granddaughter, something flickered in his expression. Not guilt, not warmth. Something more like uncertainty, like he wasn't sure which emotion he was supposed to perform. Marissa leaned forward. You made a trust without telling us? I met her stare evenly. We're allowed to make decisions without consulting you. Frank chimed in, voice shaking just slightly. We're old, but we're not, obsolete. Then he coughed, realizing the word didn't land perfectly. Not useless, he tried again. Not blind. He looked at me for reassurance. I nodded. He straightened a little. Darren exhaled sharply. Mom, this is ridiculous. The house is in Dad's name. It always has been. That's where you're wrong, I said. I pulled out the recorded deed the paper Luther slid across his oak desk with a gentle pat, like he knew it would save us trouble one day. We transferred ownership into the trust. Legally, properly, quietly. I watched the color drain from Darren's face in slow motion. It didn't happen all at once. First, his eyebrows twitched. Then his mouth dropped slightly. Then he reached for the paper with a kind of panicked politeness, as if touching it too quickly might set it on fire. Marissa grabbed the document before he could. No, she muttered. No, this can't be right. The agent checked the county site. He saw the ownership information. Frank cleared his throat and said, Yes. Well, it seems the agent checked the old file. He tried to cross his arms proudly, but misjudged the distance and knocked over a small bowl of seashells. They scattered across the floor like startled little animals. He froze. I closed my eyes, breathed, then reached down to pick them up. Frank, sweetheart, I said under my breath, maybe save the dramatic poses for later. Darren snapped. So what does this mean? I placed the final page, the one showing the trustee list, in front of him. It means, I said softly, you never had the authority to sell this house. Not yesterday, not today, not ever. He stared at the page as if it were a betrayal written in black ink. And maybe, in a way, it was. But betrayal only hurts when you've given someone trust they didn't respect. And that was the part Darren was just beginning to understand. Darren's jaw worked up and down without sound, like he was chewing invisible arguments and finding each one tougher than the last. His eyes darted across the papers, then up to me, then back down again, as if he expected the words to rearrange themselves into something more convenient. Marissa, however, didn't bother hiding her irritation. She leaned back in her chair, arms folded so tightly I wondered if she might crack a rib. This is unbelievable, she said. You two went behind our backs. I raised an eyebrow. Behind your backs? Darling, we're not teenagers sneaking out after curfew. We're two grown adults making decisions about our property. Frank coughed loudly in agreement, too loudly, and ended up choking on his own breath. He wheezed, waved a hand, then took a gulp of water that went down the wrong way, resulting in a coughing fit that made him look like a man attempting to communicate with dolphins. Darren groaned. Dad, can you not do that right now? Frank, with a hoarse whisper, replied, My body picks its own schedule, then added under his breath, Just like you pick terrible timing. I handed him a napkin and turned back to the two intruders sitting at our table. Look, I said, this house wasn't a prize waiting for someone to claim. It wasn't a safety net for you two to fall back on. It was a home we built because we wanted a place our family could feel peace in. Marissa scoffed. Then why give it to Ivy instead of Darren? The question was sharp, but the answer had been carved into my heart long before this day. Because Ivy still knows how to love without keeping score, I said. That seemed to hit Darren differently. He shifted uncomfortably, his pride deflating like one of those inflatable Christmas decorations when the power goes out. So that's it? He asked, voice suddenly smaller. You're cutting me out? No, I replied gently. You cut yourself out when you stopped seeing us as people and started seeing us as assets. He flinched, actually flinched. It was the first honest reaction I'd seen from him all day. For a moment, just a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. The boy who used to hand Frank seashells and call them treasures. The boy who used to crawl into my lap when storms scared him. But just as quickly as that softness appeared, pride came crashing back. Well, he said stiffly, I still told the buyers the house was available. They're expecting confirmation. Two can't just back out. Frank straightened with unexpected steadiness and said, Son, you didn't just step out of line. You stepped into a legal swamp in flip-flops. I almost laughed at the imagery. though the situation was far from funny. Marissa's face twisted. What's that supposed to mean? It means, I continued, your contract is invalid. You signed something you had no authority to sign, which means the buyers are going to be irritated, and they won't be irritated with us. Darren swallowed hard. I watched his throat tighten, watched the dawning realization settling in like a heavy winter storm. And if they sue? He asked quietly. That, I said gently, will be a lesson you brought upon yourself. His face went pale, the kind of pale that makes a mother's heart ache even when she's furious. Frank reached into his pocket to grab a handkerchief dramatically, but accidentally pulled out a pack of tissues, a receipt, and what looked like a button from a shirt he no longer owned. Everything tumbled onto the table. He tried to sweep it into a pile and ended up knocking over a coaster. I meant to do that, he muttered. I squeezed his arm, but Darren didn't even notice. He was staring at the trust papers, like they were the ruins of a bridge he never thought could burn. And I could feel it, this wasn't just anger anymore. It was the beginning of a reckoning he'd spent years outrunning. Darren leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead as if the truth might disappear if he pressed hard enough. Marissa kept whispering sharply into his ear, each sentence shorter and angrier than the last. I didn't catch the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Blame looking for a place to land. And Darren, sadly, was always eager to hand blame to someone else, as long as he didn't have to carry it himself. Frank tried to break the tension with a supportive pat on Darren's shoulder, but he misjudged the distance and instead smacked the back of Darren's head lightly. "Oh, sorry, son," he winced, and then added, "Your hair's softer than I remember." Darren shot him a look that could curdle milk. I gently guided Frank's hand back to his side before he did more emotional or physical damage. "Let's make this simple," I said, folding my hands in front of me. "You made a decision without us. We made a decision without you. The difference is, ours was legal." Marissa let out a frustrated growl, actually a growl, and stood up so suddenly her chair scraped across the floor like a complaint. "You two are unbelievable," she said. "We needed that sale. We planned around it. You blindsided us." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Funny," he said. "That's exactly what you did to us yesterday." She opened her mouth to snap back, but no sound came out. Instead, she threw her hands in the air and paced toward the window, staring out at the yard like it had personally betrayed her too. Darren sat in silence, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the papers as if they were a riddle designed to expose every mistake he'd ever made. "That house was supposed to secure our future," he finally said, voice shaking with something that wasn't quite anger, something closer to fear. "We're struggling, Mom. Things aren't as perfect as we told you." There it was, the truth he never wanted to say. Not arrogance, not ambition, desperation. I felt something inside me soften, but only slightly, like a frozen branch beginning to thaw, but not yet willing to bend. "Then why hide that from us?" I asked gently. "Why turn to manipulation instead of honesty?" He didn't answer. Instead, he lowered his head into his hands. Frank, bless him, tried to sit beside him in solidarity, but as he moved, his foot caught on the rug, and he stumbled forward with a noise that sounded like a startled goose. He recovered quickly and placed a hand carefully this time on Darren's back. "Son," he said softly, "we're your parents, not your obstacles." For the first time since he'd walked through the door, Darren's posture collapsed. His shoulders hunched inward, his voice quieted, and the fight drained out of him like air from a punctured tire. I thought you'd say no if I asked, and I didn't want to feel like I was failing." I exchanged a look with Frank, a long, heavy look that carried 30 years of love, worry, and shared heartbreak. "Darren," I said, sitting across from him, "failing isn't asking for help. Failing is pretending you don't need it while burning down everything around you." He wiped his face with his sleeve. Marissa turned from the window, arms still crossed but expression less fiery, more uncertain, as if she wasn't sure whether to defend him or distance herself. "And the buyers?" Darren whispered. "What am I supposed to tell them?" Frank let out a breath that was half sigh, half laugh. "Well, you could tell them the truth." Darren looked up. "What truth?" "That you tried to sell a house," Frank said. "That your parents cleverly hid from you in legal paperwork while eating clam chowder on a Tuesday." Despite the tension, I snorted. Darren blinked at us, stunned. Frank shrugged. "Hey, If you're going to be in trouble, at least make it an interesting story. But beneath the humor, something profound had shifted. Darren wasn't the conquering hero anymore. He wasn't the villain either. He was simply our son, flawed, frightened, and finally exposed. And as I watched him wrestle with the consequences of his choices, I realized the next words out of my mouth would decide whether this family broke or healed. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room felt suspended, like even the dust motes decided to stop moving just to see what would happen next. Darren sat with his head bowed, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Marissa hovered behind him, no longer furious, just unsure, the way a person looks when life suddenly removes the script they've been rehearsing. Frank stood beside me, shoulders slumped, but there was a gentleness in his face I hadn't seen in months. "Elaine," he murmured quietly, "maybe now's the time." I nodded. I walked around the table and placed a hand on Darren's shoulder. He didn't pull away. "Son," I said softly, "we didn't protect the house to punish you. We did it because we saw this path long before you did." He lifted his head, eyes red, no longer defiant. "Why didn't you say anything?" he whispered. "Because every time we tried to talk about responsibility, you heard criticism," I replied. "And every time we tried to help, you pushed us away. So we prepared quietly, hoping one day you'd come to us honestly." There was no anger left in him, only exhaustion and shame. And yet, beneath it all, relief. As if some part of him finally felt the ground under his feet again. Frank cleared his throat, rubbing the back of his neck. "Darren," he said, "this house isn't a lifeline you can yank whenever things get tough. But your mother and I, we're still here. You don't have to sink alone." Darren wiped his face with his sleeve. "I'm sorry," he said, voice trembling. "I didn't mean to treat you like tools. I just didn't know what else to do." Marissa finally spoke, though her voice was much softer now. "We've been drowning a little," she admitted, "and we thought the house would fix everything." I felt my heart break and mend at the same time. Marriage and life can corner you like that, make you believe the only way out is through someone else's sacrifice. "We can help," I said, "but not with shortcuts. If you two need guidance or budgeting help, or even a place to breathe, we can offer that. But not at the cost of our dignity or our home." Frank let out a tiny laugh. "Besides, this place is barely standing. You'd regret owning it after the first storm knocked out the power." He gestured toward the crooked porch railing. "It leans like I do after mowing the lawn," he added. Even Darren cracked a smile. A small one, but real. Finally, he stood up slowly. "I'll call the buyers," he said. "I'll tell them the deal can't go through." "That's your responsibility," I said, "and we trust you to do it." He nodded, shoulders squared, not with arrogance this time, but with acceptance, maybe even humility. Marissa slipped her hand into his. "We'll figure things out," she whispered, "together." And for the first time in a very long while, I believed her. They left quietly, closing the door with a gentleness we hadn't heard from them in years. The house felt lighter, as if exhaling. Frank wrapped an arm around me, sighing deeply. "Well," he muttered, "if that wasn't a circus, I don't know what is." I nudged him with my elbow. "You didn't help when you attacked him with your shoulder pat." "That was strategy," he protested, a surprise gesture of love. I laughed until my eyes watered. We stood together in that sunlit kitchen, surrounded by seashells, scattered pens, coffee grounds, and decades of memories. It wasn't perfect, neither were we, but it was ours. And in that moment, I realized something simple and true. We hadn't just protected a house. We had protected our place in this family, our dignity, our legacy. Frank squeezed my hand. "Guess we're tougher than they thought." "Yes," I said, resting my head on his shoulder. "We always have been, and that was our victory, quiet, steady, and entirely our own."